the wealthy countries of the world were actually as trade dependent as they are now. Actually, as of today, more trade dependent than they are today, but as trade dependent as they were before the economic crisis of the last year. But they were not nearly as interdependent when it came to travel and communication and the movement of capital. And of course, there was no internet, and therefore the sharing of information and the ability to have a common knowledge base across a wide range of areas did not exist. It didn't even really exist when I became president. There were only 50 sites on the World Wide Web when I took office. Shoot, there have been more than that added since I've been talking. The average cell phone weighed 5 pounds when I became president. Not in 1939, in 1993. So there's never been anything like this. But we know that there are significant problems with the world in which we live. We know it is too unequal, with half the world living on less than $2 a day, and 1 billion people going to bed hungry, and 1 billion people having no access to clean water, and 2.5 billion people having no access to sanitation, and 130 million people never going to school, children, and way more than that going to school without trained teachers or learning materials. The inequality in education, economics, and healthcare are enormous. 1 in 4 people this year will die, who die on Earth, will die of AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and infections related to dirty water, the diseases of the poor. You don't know anybody who's going to die of any of those things unless you have a friend with AIDS who's, unfortunately, the medicine doesn't work anymore, the second-line medicine doesn't work, or they don't keep the regime. 80% of the people who die from waterborne diseases are 5 years of age or younger. And all these things are cheaply remediable. Within wealthy countries, in most wealthy countries, inequality has increased in the last now 37 years since America went off the gold standard and we began to develop a real global financial system. A lot of the growth has been concentrated in finance. Too little has been concentrated in broadly shared prosperity, so most societies have seen increases in inequality. One of the reasons that America was set up to take a fall with this financial crisis is before it occurred, 2/3 of the American people after inflation had a lower income than they did the day I left office. Median income was $2,000 lower in real dollar terms before the financial crisis. While after inflation, healthcare costs had doubled and the cost of a university education had gone up 75%. Here's the most important bad economic statistic about America nobody knows. From the end of World War II, when Franklin Roosevelt's idea was of creating a universal access to college system through the GI Bill, was actualized by Harry Truman and the Congress. From that date until 2001, the United States every single year had the highest percentage of young people between the ages of 25 and 34 with 4-year college degrees of any place in the world. So as we had wave after wave of immigrants, we had all kinds of problems in our cities, and our public education system didn't perform particularly well. If you look at the scores today, American kids are internationally competitive at the 4th grade level. Then measured again at the 8th and 11th grade level, they're way behind most places. So we always caught up by sending more people on to higher education. In this decade, my country's fallen from 1st to 10th in the world in the percentage of young adults with 4-year degrees. And one big reason is the delivery system is not sustainable. It costs too much money for too many people, particularly if their families have flat incomes. Now, this inequality problem cannot be solved by anybody alone. It requires a communitarian mentality and a common strategy. Second problem the world has is it is highly unstable. You see that in the panic globally over swine flu, which can have quite a high mortality rate when infecting people that have no immunities. And I've learned a lot about flu immunity I didn't know. I've read all the major books about the so-called Spanish influenza epidemic after World War I, which actually started on an Army base in Kansas, not in Spain. One of the last times we ever got to shift the blame. But this influenza is interesting because even if you haven't been exposed to it, if you're over 50, you've been exposed to so many other kinds of viruses that you build up what one expert said on American television. He used a term I'd never heard. He called it peripheral immunity. So he said if old guys like me are exposed to Spanish influenza, to the swine influenza, we'll get really sick, but it probably won't kill us. We lost a 29-year-old police officer in New York City about 2 months ago, a young, strapping guy in the prime of his life because he had no immunity whatever. So we worry about that. One big school district in Texas shut down the first time swine flu cases were reported in northern Mexico. They just shut down for several weeks until they were absolutely sure nobody had been exposed. When Hillary comes home on the weekend and we take our little walks around this small town we live in north of New York City, there was a period where total strangers would come up to us on the street and ask if it was safe to take their children to New York City to a Broadway play because we'd had one reported case at that time. Which means that in their intuitive instincts, people know that the interdependent world is unstable. It leaves them vulnerable from a health point of view. We see it in the concerns we all have about the proliferation of nuclear and chemical and biological materials, about the ability of Al-Qaeda, a non-state actor, not just to do 9/11, but to carry out operations in Spain and England and Indonesia and Bali, in the Hindu part of Indonesia. And of course, we see it in this financial crisis, which began in the United States, spread quickly to Britain and Ireland, which were more heavily leveraged in their financial institutions than we were, then totally engulfed and destroyed the government of tiny Iceland. Sadly, Iceland had the highest percentage of self-made millionaires of any country in Europe. Not from finance, from enterprise, traditional enterprise. But their government had permitted financial institutions to become so leveraged that they offered outlandish returns to pension plans, for example, in small English villages. And when it all came crashing down around their ears, the whole government was replaced at the same time. Then all of a sudden, China, which has no money problems, they were sitting on $2 trillion in cash reserves, much of which you and I gave them by buying Chinese products. They still had 35 million unemployed factory workers and worried deeply about real instability in the country because the rest of the world could no longer buy so many of their products. Capital flows, which reach $2 trillion a day worldwide, crossing national borders, have shrunk 75% in the wake of the global financial crisis. So this age of interdependence has been pretty good to most of us, or we wouldn't be sitting here. You just look around this room, there's more diversity in this room and more women in this room than there would have been if we'd had this meeting 30 years ago, right? We've gotten a lot of benefits out of it, but it is both unequal and unstable. And finally, because of climate change, it is unsustainable. There are a handful of people who still seriously question whether it's that big a problem, but that's what they are, a handful. Some of them are pretty distinguished. A distinguished American physicist, Freeman Dyson, an 83-year-old icon of American science, and a liberal Democrat who supported Barack Obama for president, says he just thinks everybody else is wrong. What I think is, I want my daughter and the grandchildren I hope to have to live on a planet that will sustain them and people just like them in every other part of the world. And I think I'll stay with the 95% and not the 5%.